I declare a full emergency immediately.
This is the horrific tale of South African Airways Flight 295. Far above the Indian Ocean, on a pitch-black night, a fully loaded Boeing 747 is engulfed in flames. In a last-ditch effort to get out of the suffocating smoke, 140 scared passengers scramble to the front of the plane. In a desperate attempt to bring their plane down, the pilots took it into a frightening dive. Are they going to have any hope of reaching a little island in the middle of the ocean? Or will the flames destroy them? One that has an unexpected turn of events. At Taipei, Taiwan, on the evening of November 27, 1987, a Boeing 747 operated by South African Airways, carrying 140 passengers and 19 crew members, took off. They were traveling to Johannesburg, South Africa, via Mauritius. The 10-hour flight to Mauritius made for an arduous journey. The true narrative of Flight 295 remains a mystery and a conspiracy to this day. Regarding what transpired on board the aircraft during its flight over the southern Indian Ocean, important individuals cannot agree. And the reason for that is that this was never going to be your typical flight. We'll attempt to put together the events of Flight 295 in this video, utilizing 3 important jigsaw pieces. The narrative starts in Taipei, with the passengers boarding and the airplane being loaded with goods. A variant of the 747, known as the Combi, which accommodated both passengers and cargo on one deck, was operated by South African Airways. The enormous aircraft had 2/3 dedicated to passenger transport and 1/3 to freight. In addition to many Japanese and Taiwanese nationals, as well as a few travelers from Europe and Australia, the bulk of the passengers were South Africans going home. The crew up in the cockpit was very seasoned. David Ice, a 49-year-old former Air Force pilot with about 14,000 flight hours, was the captain. He had been silently worried about one of his biggest nightmares for years, and in a few hours, he would finally be facing it. The 36-year-old First Officer, David Hamilton, was seated to his right. Like the captain, Hamilton accumulated nearly 7,000 hours of flight time, of which around 4,000 were spent aboard the 747. Giuseppe Bellegarde, a 45-year-old flight engineer, trailed the 2 pilots. He had flown the 747 for thousands of hours as well. He would be the first to learn the real severity of the emergency on this particular night. 2 additional flight attendants were in the cockpit, prepared to take over throughout the trip's lengthy oceanic voyage, considering how long the journey was expected to last. These were flight engineer Alan George Daniel, 34, and relief pilot Jeffrey Burchell, 37. Everything seemed normal as the crew prepared their enormous aircraft for takeoff on one of the airline's longest journeys. However, if certain reports of this incident are accurate, a severe problem has already arisen. We'll get back to what this could be shortly. That evening, just after 10 o'clock, the 747 was forced to retreat from the Taipei gate. As the pilots prepared their aircraft for takeoff, the 140 passengers settled in for the lengthy flight. It would be an uncommon path to Mauritius. South Africa was a global outcast in the 1980s. Because of its radical and racist administration, it was prohibited from entering the airspace of other nations. Flight 295 tonight would be the same as those departing from Europe that had to travel around the whole African continent in order to reach South Africa. It would have to fly across the South China Sea to the south, following the coast of Vietnam and then veering southwest to travel towards Mauritius, all while avoiding airspace in Southeast Asia. These limitations would be an essential component of one of the cases that we will discuss in a moment. Flight 295 took off into the night sky at 25 minutes past 10 local time, speeding down the Taipei runway. As the aircraft headed south toward Mauritius, the captain made the difficult turn. The battle reached its initial cruising altitude, high above the South China Sea, around 30 minutes after launch. As they proceeded southward on the prearranged course, the pilots routinely reported their positions to air traffic authorities in Bangkok, Kuala Lumpur, and Hong Kong. Everything was proceeding as planned thus far. The pilots also made a regular call to a South African Airways radio station in Johannesburg around 90 minutes after takeoff. A radio operator working for South African Airways manned this station, which went by the name ZUR or ZUR around the clock. ZUR was created to give the airline the ability to monitor its global fleet of planes and address issues as they emerged. At a period when the country's political climate made it extremely difficult to operate internationally, the airline regarded it as a crucial service. Actually, British Airways and South African Airways were the only two airlines worldwide offering this kind of service. But something strange, really very strange, was going to happen at ZUR this evening. Something like this would open the door to an incredibly dark interpretation of what was about to happen. The passenger compartment saw a bar service as the pilots conversed in the cockpit. Dinner service followed shortly after this. Meals on long-haul flights that depart late at night are usually served in this manner. Following the serving of dinner and beverages, the passengers go to sleep until the aircraft reaches its destination. The pilots, of course, were not allowed to partake in the entire drink service menu, but when it came time for dinner, they were fed meals prepared in the first-class cabin. But the food had become boring after all these years of the same old dinners, and the pilots grumbled to one another while they ate. We have many minutes of this dinner conversation on the cockpit voice recorder, so we know it actually happened. However, as you may have noticed from watching a couple of these movies, the audio recorder in the cockpit only captures the last 30 minutes of the flight, and this is when this flight's first oddity shows itself. Within the next 30 minutes, Flight 295 does not crash. It will actually be traveling across the southern Indian Ocean for the next 8 hours. So why is the voice recorder in the cockpit discussing dinner? Dining occurred close to the start of the journey, several hours before the aircraft would ultimately declare an emergency to air traffic control in Mauritius. Here's where the first of those three parts of the puzzle fits in. Let's hear what the voice recorder in the cockpit has to say. This shows the precise instant the first hint of disaster arises, upsetting the serene tranquility of the cockpit. The pilot's soothing tones should not be taken as gospel. They were now dealing with an in-flight fire, the greatest emergency an airplane can encounter. You are aware of how rapidly an airplane may be destroyed by fire if you have watched my film about Swiss Air Flight 111. The pilots of Flight 295 immediately went to work, going through checklists in an attempt to identify the type and origin of the fire and put it out. The scope of the fire became visible in a matter of seconds. The reason the battle engineer noted the bursting circuit breakers was because the fire was consuming the electrical wires to which they were connected. The smoke alarm wasn't only going off because of some cigarette smoke. This was burning up like crazy. The main deck cargo area, directly behind the passengers, was where the fire had spread, according to the pilot's instruments. They needed to put it out quickly. They had to take action right now if they were going to survive the descent. However, following the trip of numerous circuit breakers, the cables leading to the voice recorder in the cockpit became the next casualty of the fire. As the fire burnt through the wire, providing power to the cockpit voice recorder, this was the last sound it captured. We are now at a loss as to what may be learned from this inquiry, and two alternative outcomes are hidden in this darkness. Two lightsabers. When the voice recorder in the cockpit blinkered out of existence, where was Flight 295? Was it in this place? Was it here or somewhere else? We need to examine the second of the three puzzle pieces in order to help us respond to that question. This is a tape of a discussion that took place in Mauritius between Captain Ice and an air traffic controller. This is not to be confused with the internal cockpit audio tape that we just heard. This audio recording comes from a cassette that was taken from Mauritius's control tower. As you...
Mauritius, bring back to 905. Good morning. We have a smoke problem, and we're doing emergency descent to level 140. Have you wished to descend to level 140? Yeah, we have already commenced due to a smoke problem in the airplane. Roger, you are clear to descend. You need me to level 140. Roger, we are on the pre-send. If you can alert the fire up. Did you request a full emergency? Okay, how can you move? Sorry, go ahead. Do you request a full emergency, please? A full emergency? That's Charlie. Roger, I declare a full emergency. Roger. Thank you.
The pilots were now swiftly descending to 14,000 feet, around 200 miles away from Mauritius. This audio should definitely end the dispute now. It demonstrates that before the fire erupted, the plane had successfully flown all the way to Mauritius across the ocean. Accordingly, the fire must have started 200 miles from Mauritius and recorded the emergence of the fire using the cockpit voice recorder. However, the fire quickly cut off the recorder's power supply, and the pilot started to descend and spoke with air traffic control. Everything fits. However, there's still the matter of the dinner conversation. It seems that the fire started when the pilots were eating dinner, even though they did not consume it right before starting their descent. Thus, we are left with two options. The air traffic control recording places the fire here, although the dinner talk has it starting here. Which might it be? At this time, it's probably rather evident that the fire started near to Mauritius. It was to those air traffic controllers, not those in Thailand or Malaysia, that the pilots had declared an emergency. Captain Ice and his crew knew full well that they had to divert right away to the closest airfield due to an onboard fire. Pilots often have less than 20 minutes from the start of a fire to land their aircraft before the flames completely consume it. Given that the pilots attempted to land near Mauritius, it makes sense that the fire happened in the vicinity of that island. The jet would have tried to reroute to somewhere in Thailand or Malaysia if the fire had started while it was here, near Asia. Or, if we remove the third and last jigsaw piece, that's how the picture appears. I brought up the radio advertisement ZR, which is run by South African Airways in Johannesburg near the beginning of this film. It is staffed around the clock and maintains constant communication with all of the airline's global planes. And happily, tape recordings of these talks exist. Over the course of the day, the tape recorders capture every word exchanged between the pilots and the station. Maybe we can address these discrepancies that we have discovered thus far by using this tape. Perhaps it will pinpoint the precise location of the aircraft when the pilots initially noticed a fire. Here's the issue, though. This evening's tape is vanished. There is the one from the previous night, securely kept in ZR, and there is also the one from the subsequent night. However, the tape that documents the crucial moment when Flight 295 would have communicated with ZIR has disappeared. Why might this important piece of evidence have vanished? Is there something on that tape that South African Airways doesn't want the world to hear? Or is it just an unfortunate coincidence? Like in a jigsaw puzzle, even in the absence of a piece, its shape is still discernible in the empty space it leaves behind. The Zura tape's complete absence is proof in and of itself, and that evidence leads us to a horrific scenario involving not one, but two fires. Think about the following. Angola, South Africa's neighbor to the north, was the target of a bloody conflict in 1987. It had a significant issue, but it required an enormous supply of weapons and equipment to fight this battle. At the time, South Africa was subject to an arms embargo, which made it extremely difficult for the military to get the necessary armaments and supplies. Consequently, the nation's administration took an unimaginable action. In order to supply military hardware to its forces in Angola, it started utilizing commercial passenger jets for weaponry shipment. It specifically hired the military weapons manufacturer Armscor to provide it with missiles, poisons, and other weapons, which it then placed onto South African Airways passenger planes. Many high-ranking airline officials were all too willing to use the aircraft to convey these commodities because they had previously worked with Armscor. Knowing that this was happening, a large number of South African Airways pilots felt uneasy about the practice. Indeed, during interviews conducted in the years after Flight 295, the wife of Captain Ice had recalled that her husband had expressed worries about having to approve cargo that he thought was unsafe to carry on multiple occasions. Significantly, by doing this, South African Airways violated international law. The airline would be destroyed if it turned out to be carrying weapons of mass destruction on board a passenger jet. There would be no communication from South Africa to the outside world. Now that we have this established, let's return to the third puzzle piece and see where the missing ZIR tape comes in. Let's act out a situation that makes sense given the information at hand. South African Airways Flight 295 is cruising high above the South China Sea in the middle of the night. An alert goes off in the cockpit as the pilots are chatting among themselves. One of the pallets in the cargo compartment, directly behind the passengers, has begun to spew smoke. The pilots start working on the issue right away, going through the checklists in order to put out the fire. The pilot is aware that weapons that South African Airlines illegally brought on board may have been the source of this fire. He is also aware that his plane will be inspected upon landing if he manages to get to a nearby airport and reports an emergency to air traffic control. And he is aware that the airline will be destroyed if this inspection reveals weapons that have been brought illegally. He would lose his position, and South Africa would lose its national airline. Captain Eyes must make a choice as the pilots follow the checklists and try to put out the fire. Should he land right away or continue to Mauritius if he can put out the fire? He contacts Zur via radio from Johannesburg, requesting advice from the airline. Senior airline officials are consulted by the radio operator, who gives the captain the instruction to put out the fire and proceed to Mauritius. They are aware that the airline will lose everything if Flight 295 declares an emergency and lands at this time. In this version of events, the pilots put out the fire and proceed to Mauritius, where a few hours later it rekindles and becomes disastrous. For the sake of argument, let's pretend that this is what actually happened. During the critical minutes when the fire initially started, Captain Aya's priority would undoubtedly be to save his own life and the lives of his passengers over any political or professional concerns. Was he really going to put more than 100 lives in danger in order to keep his job and the national airline? We're not really sure what happened this night without the Zor tapes. The night's radio operator has maintained to this day that he lost contact with the airplane for the remainder of its journey, except for a brief period of regular conversation shortly after Taipei's departure. Other people, however, stated that it would have been highly unusual for a flight to lose touch for that length of time. And for that reason, the missing XOR tapes hold such significance. Without them, it is impossible to determine if Flight 295 was given the go-ahead to put out the fire and carry on with the journey, only to have it rekindle as it got closer to Mauritius and bring the aircraft down. We do know, however, that when the aircraft got closer to Mauritius, there was a fire on board. The front right pallet in the freight area caught fire just behind the passengers. The passengers bolted to the front of the airplane to escape the heat and smoke rising from the blazing inferno behind them as the pilots initiated a rapid descent. A flight attendant hurried to put out the fire in the cargo area, but before she could do so, she dropped their fire extinguisher because the flames was already too large to put out. To stop harmful smoke and odors from spreading throughout the cabin, the pilots switched off the recirculation fans. However, the amount of smoke entering the cabin was almost unaffected by turning off the recirculating fans due to the fire's ferocity and sheer volume of smoke produced. The smoke permeated the entire aircraft, causing carbon monoxide poisoning that claimed several lives. The fire started to burn through wire in the aircraft ceiling, disabling the pilot's instruments one by one as each item on the checklist failed to stop its progress. They were trying urgently to coordinate their arrival with Mauritius air traffic control, but their plane's sights and ears were malfunctioning.
Now, for the electrics, we haven't got anything on the aircraft now. Roger, I declare full emergency immediately.
There was not much more time left, and they were still over 150 miles away from the airport. The pilots reached a stage in the fire and smoke checklist where they had to take action that was unimaginable for a passenger aircraft as the actual smoke accumulated within the cabin and the cockpit. They were instructed to open a door in midair. As the aircraft hovered hundreds of feet over the ocean, a flight attendant hurried over to open the front cabin door. Outside, screaming winds approaching 400 kilometers per h were accompanied by nothing but a pitch-black abyss. Whatever respite from the smoke this provided for the passengers, it was insufficient to put out the fire, which raged on and is now consuming vital aircraft systems. The air rushing through the cabin made a significant amount of noise, forcing the pilots to shout at each other. It got harder and harder to make out what was going on as night fell, and their instruments failed. The pilots continued to fight for as long as they could, but they were losing the war. The aircraft's structure was now starting to deteriorate due to the fire. Flight 295 broke apart in midair at 7 minutes past 4 in the morning local time, more over 100 miles from the airport. After colliding with the sea in 3 sections, the aircraft submerged itself to a depth of 14,000 feet. Not a single person survived. What then started the fire? What was the cargo compartment's front right pallet carrying? Sections of the debris that were dredged up from the ocean floor were investigated by the official investigation. They were unable to identify the fire's origin, though. It was determined by fire specialists that the fire burned at a temperature well over 1,000 degrees Celsius, indicating the presence of highly flammable elements. What further evidence is there, then, if the physical evidence is not conclusive in and of itself? What about the flight's cargo manifest that was created in Taipei? Well, not too long after the mishap, it was destroyed. However, throughout the course of the investigation, a different version surfaced, and it indicated that the fire originated from the front right pallet, which contained an assignment of computer components. Among these parts were lithium batteries, which are infamous for catching fire. A passenger jet would not be brought down by bursting batteries for the first or last time. However, other investigators believed that the batteries carried on this aircraft were too small to start a fire of this kind, even though they were not known to catch fire on their own. Upon analyzing the debris, a few specialists in fire concluded that the fire's intensity required the ignition source to have its own oxygen supply. Nothing on the cargo manifest suited this description, but once more, this wouldn't be the first time South African Airlines has snuck hazardous materials onto its planes without declaring them. Conspiracy theories regarding the actual contents of the cargo compartment are still prevalent today for this reason, among the others I've covered in this video.